Our topic is about building strong foundations and the connection between basic knowledge that we need to have around child development, epigenetics, and the impact of environment on children's development, our role as FDRPs. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know, either putting your hand up or using the chat, and we can delve in a little bit deeper as we go. There's a fair few links in the presentation today, so I will make that available to members as well, so you can follow some of those links if you want to. But before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as traditional owners and custodians of country in Australia, recognise their continued connection with the lands, waters and culture, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I come to you today from the beautiful lands of the Gunai people in Gippsland in Victoria. So welcome. I'll just do a brief overview of what we're looking at. We'll have a quick look at the family law context of understanding child developmental needs, a little about ages and stages and how those are affected. We'll look at attachment and some of the resources around that, and how gene environment interactions impact long-term, sometimes generationally, through families. There's a lot of really good research that gives us much more insight into the real danger, chronic exposure to high stress environments common in family violence situations. Some of you are students, some of you are practitioners, and we should all now know that there's been substantial changes in the way that the best interests of the child are interpreted, and it's gone from, it was almost around parents' rights and assumptions around what parents would bring automatically, to looking at it in a much more nuanced way. We're now looking at what arrangements would promote the safety of the child and each person who cares for the child, recognising that if a person caring for a child is in an unsafe situation, it's going to impact the child. They're going to be exposed to family violence. We're now required to look at the history of family violence and family violence orders. We always were, but it's articulated a bit more strongly now. And so we can have those conversations around what that history has, how it has impacted. And thank you very much for sharing where you're coming from. Any views expressed by the child, and again, many of us have expressed concerns about how this may be used or misused, but it is important. The right to having a say in their life, particularly for more mature children, is really important. I've underlined the developmental, psychological, emotional and cultural needs of the child. The only way that these things can be considered is if they're discussed and if they're understood. So what are the developmental needs of a 1-year-old compared to a 10-year-old? They're not the same. And so making sure that we as practitioners and parents have an understanding of what some of these things might mean, and also the psychological and emotional needs. So as we know, many people have grown up in really suboptimal or abusive or neglectful environments, and so their understanding of what is appropriate and safe may be really quite skewed. And also we now need to have a conversation about the capacity of each person who has care to be able to fulfill those responsibilities. If someone's talking about drug abuse or mental health issues or other aspects, how do we have a conversation with parents about how that may impact their ability to care for children? And then, of course, the benefit of relationships with children. We'll have a look at how that relates to attachment and attachment disorders. And this isn't the wording from the Family Law Act. This is a summary from one of the information pages on the Attorney General's website. There's information there for families that's intended to assist as well. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, their right to enjoy their connections and culture, and of course anything individual for children. So how does this relate to family violence and the other aspects of our role? If we take a longitudinal view, it wasn't really until the late 90s and 2000s that exposure to family violence became really articulated, and that really happened as the developmental impacts of exposure to family violence became very, very clear through a number of studies. We know that exposure to violence and a lack of sense of safety can cause harm to children, even if they're not directly targeted. We know that they are going to have an increased probability of being a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence in their adult relationships. And so there's long-term effects on behaviours, expectations and relationships. It's been articulated as a human right for children to live free of violence in their home. Just to very quickly looking at those aspects. So most, like the physical, sexual abuse, neglect, not providing the necessities of life, those things are fairly stark, such as not providing emotional support, deliberately targeting emotions to manipulate or punish, name-calling or disparaging children, withholding affection in order to manipulate, threatening to give them away or leave. If you sit in a food court long enough in a shopping centre, you're probably going to hear some of these behaviours, but they are emotional abuse. And depending on your background and experience, you may even just dismiss some of these as just frustrated parents. So as professionals working in this area, we've really got to think about how these things are impacting the children in the homes, and how do we have these conversations with parents while still maintaining rapport and ability to work with them. That's psychological abuse. I've got the little arrow because they're very closely linked. With the psychological, it's around threats and manipulation to control the child, deliberately lying or distorting reality. And that's probably not talking about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. It's making it very difficult for them to understand the world because of the deliberate manipulations. Humiliating or shaming children, which sometimes parents see as a way of teaching them, but it can be really, really harmful. And blaming the child for the way that life turned out. You know, you ruined my life whenever they're angry. If you hadn't come along, whatever. Pretty stark, but we need to be mindful of those conversational approaches to what is abuse, and particularly psychological abuse. For those that are familiar with the Duluth model, there's some models around children that are, I think, quite useful and might be something you could use with parents as a simple device to help them to think about what might be appropriate parenting, what nurturing parenting looks like. Particularly, we often find that parents might have very different styles and approaches, and this can form a basis for conversation. Has anyone ever done that using tools such as the Nurturing Children Wheel or others to have these conversations? It can be useful, particularly for parents that are self-aware of the limitations of their own parenting. Perhaps something that you could talk through during the pre-mediation stage and leave them to think about in terms of their parenting plan. Have a quick look at child development. When we're working with parents, we need to think about the age of the children. The needs of a 1-year-old are very different from a 12-year-old. So parenting plans, a plan that works for a 1-year-old doesn't have to be applied for the 12-year-old. They can have different connections and interactions with their parents. One parent will keep one child, and that sort of thing isn't really done much anymore. It can be a little bit more nuanced. Yes, we've got the physical development, but we've also got the emotional and psychological development, so the attachment formation in the 3 to 6, and it varies depending on the child. Learning emotional regulation. If they've got parents who don't know how to emotionally regulate, often the children aren't learning that as well, because that family environment is their major influence unless they're in comprehensive childcare. middle school, and then adolescence. So I'm not sure if the butterfly metaphor really works, but it's kind of pretty. We can help to point out to parents that there's resources and information available to assist them, because often that gets missed. They go home with the baby and they've got to kind of work it out. Eric Erickson's, he's the person that the phrase identity crisis, and he sees transitioning through these stages of development as little crisis points to get beyond. With appropriate support and care, they're answering that question, can I trust the world? Yes, if they can trust caregivers and others. But if, let's say, they've got parents that aren't coping and they leave the baby to cry for hours, they don't support its needs, they scream at it when it's crying, they learn to develop doubt and fear and mistrust in people because they're not safe. One of the things we need to reinforce with clients is that when children are very young, they're at their most vulnerable in terms of how mistreatment, neglect, or abuse is going to impact them. And they're developing brains. And they get into that 2 to 3 sort of age, they're starting to develop autonomy, starting to see themselves as a separate person. Is it okay to be me? If they've got parents that delight in them and help them grow and explore, then they develop self-confidence. Otherwise, according to this model, it's more around developing shame and self-doubt. Then as they're getting older, is it okay to explore and develop their own interests? And this is where they can become obsessed with dinosaurs or cars or whatever it is. If that's okay and supported, otherwise they develop guilt for being interested in whatever it is that they're interested in. And then as they're getting older into school, can I be competent? Are they recognised for being able to do things? If they're not supported, then that's where they can become unmotivated and unwilling to engage. And then the wonderful identity stage of 12 to 19, maybe younger these days, of trying to work out who they are and explore their identity. And again, under this model, if they're pushed to conform too hard, that can result in confusion and feeling lost. So there's a lot of different models. I thought it was interesting to look at one. One of the models that's been around since the early last century is attachment theory. It's really stood the test of time, and something that you'll be coming up against a lot with clients you'll be dealing with is those that have got the adult expression of these insecure attachments from their own developmental time. If the parents provide good support for children, they're going to have secure attachment, they're going to have self-confidence, and they're going to be able to cope well with things. With anxious parents, they can be very over-controlling, intrusive, not allowing that autonomy to develop through their fears for their child. That's something we see a lot where there's been family violence and the survivor of that can hold tightly to their child and inadvertently cause harm. And again, the avoidance, so emotional neglect or rejection. So where maybe bonds were there, but they get broken and it's inconsistent here and there, or just emotionally unavailable. That can cause problems for children. Disorganized, where the caregivers that the child depends on are very erratic, frightening, or literally harming them deliberately or through willful acts. That causes a great deal of disruption to development. There's a really good video. I won't have time to show it, but it's a program in the US where they've got some case studies with parents who have these insecure attachment styles and are learning how to connect with their babies and develop a better security for the children. Has anyone got any comments or thoughts about this attachment? There's another model, but basically, if we put it on an axis, secure attachment is low avoidance, so they're able to make connections, they've got positive models of other people, and low anxiety, so they've got positive models of themselves. So they've got self-confidence and they're not fearful of what others might think of them, whereas these other Examples are either avoiding and fearful of others because of the negative models, and also having a negative attitude to themselves. So often there's a very high correlation with drug abuse and other strategies to avoid reality for people with that ambivalent model. One of the really good models to help parents is the circle of security. Has anyone come across this? They're, I think, out of the UK. Basically, it's the same stuff I was talking about, but it's articulated in a very simple to understand way. Parents need to be a secure base for the child to explore, not hold them so close that they don't develop self-confidence skills, but also be a safe haven for them to return to. Protect me, comfort me, delight in me, and organise my feelings, help them deal with those big feelings when they're just learning to experience and coming back when they need it, but also supporting them to explore. They talk about always being bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. It's a really nice model. They have training for people, or it can be something you can share. The bottom line is secure attachment figures are necessary for healthy child development. I'm old enough to remember they found in Romania these orphanages. They had a whole lot of orphanages. These children were fed and cleaned to a degree, but there was no love, there was no affection, and they were severely damaged by that. Ongoing studies have found it really difficult as they've grown, because children need more than just their physical needs, which is why the Family Law Act now articulates that their psychological and emotional needs are equally important. So when we're working with parents, we need to prioritise that full gamut of children's needs and be talking with parents in those terms. If they were raised in violent, neglectful or abusive homes, they may not know how to. What often happens is that they're triggered by the needs of their children because their own needs weren't met. It can be really triggering for them when their children reach out for them. Epigenetics, how our gene expression is altered by environmental factors. We all come with a code, our genes, but how they are expressed strongly impacted by our environment. So the stress, trauma, violence cause chemical modifications. And here's just a couple of examples. When children are exposed to family violence, their stress response system, so the hypothalamic, pituitary and adrenal glands are overused, and they can become dysfunctional, constantly being flooded and triggered with stress. So it becomes a negative loop. So they become more sensitive to stressors, and then that escalation continues. It creates what's called epigenetic changes. It impairs their emotional regulation, which makes them more likely, when they've got a parent who's easily triggered, for further abuse or lack of nurturing caregiving. They become a difficult child at school. They get expelled rather than cared for. They get excluded by the school from education because they're too difficult, and eventually can have a really, really profound negative effect on them. And that increases their vulnerability to mental health issues, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. So basically setting up their brains to be less functional, healthy. They can become biologically embedded and passed on to future generations. You've probably heard about generational trauma in the context for Aboriginal families. It's very highly present there, understandably, because of the many stolen generations and legacy from colonisation. But what happens is the epigenetic markers get passed along through the genes, through the development process, as well as problems with the parents, behaviour and attachment patterns. So they're probably, there's hypervigilance, emotional deregulations, difficulty in providing emotional safety, as well as the biological changes that get transmitted generationally. It's a really toxic mix, and so it'd be good to be part of the helping to interrupt these cycles by helping to, Joe?
No, they also, I saw a program years ago, also people that are in wars and that type of thing. they were passed on from generation. They couldn't work out why the children were behaving in such a way,
Yeah.
but what their parents went through and so on is passed through the genes. They couldn't work out why, because they didn't go through wars or anything, but it actually did pass through the genes and finally worked out why.
So there was a fair bit of research that was done. Bessel van der Kolk, that's a really good presentation to watch. And he did a lot of research on the Vietnam vets. So that was, yeah, really where they started to realise, and then they went back and looked at Second World War people. It's still not necessarily understood by people. They might see the child as being naughty or difficult, but there's been a lot going on. One of the programs we've been engaged with, Bill Eddy, he comes at it from a high conflict perspective, but very much talking about the changes that are happening. He shares in his training for parents what happens with the corpus callosum if young children are exposed to too much stress. It reduces the bridge between the brain hemispheres, impacting emotional regulation. This is a course available in Australia through Interact Support. It's $95 for parents and they can apply for a scholarship if needed. It's a good way for them to get some understanding about these impacts. Some government funded services are running programs that might go through some of these things as well. Parents can't make good decisions if they don't understand the impact of saying, I wish you were never born to a child. So as FDRPs, we want to stand at the top of the cliff and try and stop things from happening. Not all children exposed to family violence have worse outcomes than the average child. So what are some of the factors? Peer and social support's really protective, particularly with older children when they're at that developmental stage where their peer relationships are so critical to their normal development. If parents are doing a plan that's going to pull them out of their school, pull them away from there. So asking questions, how's that's going to impact the children? Do they have any important relationships? How is that going to help? Parents, grandparents, so they're often completely severed during a relationship breakdown, but we know during that preschool, primary school age, extended family can be a critical part of healthy development. Asking questions about how those connections can be helped and where possible help parents put whatever was said during the breakup behind them and think about whether those relationships are still going to be protective and supportive for their kids. Positive relationships with their primary caregivers. The attachment research was kind of misused after the Second World War. Rather than talking about primary caregivers, it was changed to primary caregiver, mother, in an effort to get mothers back out of the factories where they were having a great time and back into the home, because there needed to be jobs for the men coming back from the war. We know from attachment research that's continued on, it's the security of the attachment, not necessarily the gender of the caregiver, that is critical for the child's development. Usually in a nuclear family, it's going to be the mother that's the primary caregiver and the father perhaps is doing more of the outside out of the home work, but other arrangements can be just as protective and supportive for children. It's really important to ask as an FDRP, how were the arrangements before you separated? Who was doing the primary caregiving? If they're upset, who's able to comfort them? These days, it may equally be both parents, but have a conversation. They can certainly have one or more secure attachment figures, but you probably know from your own families or others that at certain times children will pick someone who's their person and that's who they'll cling to if they need to. So, that needs to be acknowledged. The duration of the violence, a single incident of violence can be harmful and result in a post-traumatic stress condition, but generally chronic ongoing exposure to stress that's going to have the worst outcomes. It's not necessarily the high peak. They're walking on eggshells, really worried about what's going to happen, that's keeping those stress hormones high in those poor little developing brains. That's the message we need to get through. Treatment's possible. So there's been a number of studies that show that children who receive adequate response and treatment following an incident fare better than those that are just left to sort it out. Many parents and grandparents, the concept of mental health conditions in children wasn't a thing when they were growing up. It wasn't considered. So, trying to help clients to get their children to support if there has been exposure to family violence or other traumatic incidents is very helpful. And age. So older children generally fare better than younger children. So that again, there's myths around. I've heard clients say to me, oh, they're only little, they wouldn't remember. It's not about remembering, it's about what it's done to their brain.
No, it's not just that, as it says there. It kind of concentrates on kids, but the thing is, it can go right into adulthood if it actually continues on and on. Different things that I had. It's kind of like being in a pinball machine type of thing. You don't find anyone that actually can make up for what other things have done beforehand. So they may fare better if they're older, or they're just becoming more resistant, and probably depending on the changes in the way they find the ways to cope with it, may not be the best solutions.
No, absolutely. Because the connections that they might make, like a lot of the new refugees that come, they've been through a high amount of trauma and they'll often connect in with other kids like them, and then they become a gang. People become fearful of them. They're pretty reactive because they've just come out of a war zone and haven't necessarily got support. So, we can see that cycle playing out in places. But the good news is these things can be undone to an extent, but rarely accidentally. There's some work needed. Our role extends beyond facilitating agreements between parents. We have to ensure children's safety, well-being and long-term developmental needs are really considered and central to the decision making. So understanding trauma, the epigenetic impacts of exposure to high stress environments is important, and we need to share that information with clients. It'll depend on your background and knowledge, whether you're comfortable to speak directly, whether you have tools that you can share or resources, referrals, all of the above. But we need to understand trauma as well. Anyone coming out of the family violence sector will be used to thinking in victim perpetrator terms. All of your perpetrators have probably been victims at some point in their life, and they're playing out behaviours that they've seen as making you bigger and stronger, and certainly not wiser or kind. So I suppose in our role as FDRPs, we need to have compassion around people and also a degree of rigour around behaviour and what is safe for children, which is not an easy balance that we walk. Techniques include information resources and referrals to specialist knowledge support courses. Child inclusive practice can be a way of getting that information in for parents, particularly where there's been maybe not high stress incidents, but lots of ongoing stress, for parents to get an understanding, or even just understanding age appropriate treatment. And really focusing on helping parents understand the importance of stable, nurturing, safe environments for their kids. So again, our role, child safety, risk assessment, trauma-informed practice, and understanding how people affected by trauma react and are reactive. So if this is something that you're thinking, oh, I don't know that much about it, it's really probably an area to put in your professional development and think about finding out more about that. Child-focused facilitation, making sure that discussions are centred on child wellbeing rather than rights or time negotiations. Parental education and connecting families with therapeutic, legal and support services. So making sure that you understand the sorts of therapeutic supports available within your communities can be helpful as well. These days a lot more is online, but it needs to be work that understands these issues. And of course, we are mandatory reporters. We have to report suspected child abuse or neglect to our state welfare authority. Even if your background makes you cynical about those services, it is an obligation. So the contact details for each state varies and the process, so you need to know It relates where the people are or where the child is actually. It's become more complicated as more of our work's done online. Australian Institute of Family Studies has got a good resource for mandatory reporting, which I think would be very helpful for anyone to have access. So if you're working with a family that the children are in a different state to you, you may need to make a report there rather than your local people. And as we know, with the new regs, we've got obligations around keeping our files and information. If you need to make a mandatory report, or even if you're considering whether you need to, I'd strongly encourage you to make a file note. You don't have to tell the parents if you're making a report. And if you're making that sort of file note, keep it very factual, what it is that you observed or what they said that caused you to feel that you needed to make that report. I've got a few references and links. There's been adverse childhood experiences. There was a really good study around that influenced the changes to the family law regime. These days it's very easy to research thanks to our wonderful AI companions, but you still have to check how valid and relevant is the resource. So questions, comments, thoughts?
No, I'm just wondering, do we have will we get a copy of those PowerPoint presentation or?
Yeah, we'll get that uploaded so you're able to access the links. That'll be in the recorded webinars area of MI members. If you're not a member but you've registered, send an email to the office and we'll send you the link for it.
Thanks.
No worries.
Thank you, Joy. This has been most informative and well put together.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
Just to encourage everyone to think about putting together a little resource you can share with parents. If you find the situation, I've got a new case coming up, and just looking at what one of the parties has said, I'm thinking, oh, there sounds like there's attachment sort of stuff. And we're not diagnosing, but we're thinking, what are the likely issues we're going to encounter there? And it's a 2-year-old child. So I'll be preparing information about the needs around a 2-year-old because it sounds like there's a lot of disagreement between the parents.
Joanne, can I ask a question? Some of these things are quite culturally specific.
Yes.
So, particularly definitions of what constitutes neglect and emotional and psychological abuse. Is that something you develop over time in your practice, or are we expected to adhere to a Western British kind of model? Or can we use our judgment to take into account that there might be some cultural differences at play?
Absolutely. We need to think about how or why would this be harmful. I was just having a conversation with Dan about that earlier today. The whole concept of primary caregiver, for example, is a very Western, nuclear family model where in many cultures, the baby's passed around, including staying overnight with others. Yeah, and Brooke shared the concept of good enough parenting. Have a look at that Duluth model of supportive parenting. I think it works to a degree cross-culturally, because what we were talking about was bedtime, for a typical Australian family that's got the kids in pajamas at 5 o'clock, having them out at 10 p.m. is child abuse. For other cultures, it's like, yeah. So
like it's not very horrifying to see children up at 8 o'clock, but I've seen a lot of people being horrified at that.
absolutely.
That's a difference.
Oh, no, to be quite honest, I had the habit as a kid not going to bed till my parents went to bed. So I'd stay up because I'd just get out of bed. So even up to midnight, I'd be up, as a little kid. So
I can imagine that, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. It is a really good point to consider because we need to think about our own biases and our own cultural experience. I think it's okay as an FDRP for us to ask questions and have a conversation with parents. But the other thing is, There's some things that objectively risk behaviour. I had a case where they wanted to do the changeovers at 11 o'clock at night at a city McDonald's. Mum was going to drop the kids off, then she'd leave, and then Dad had come and pick them up. And it was just like, guys, there were so many things that could happen here. What if he doesn't arrive? What if a mad druggie comes in, and eventually they couldn't account that to, culturally, that they both thought it was fine. Like, they didn't see there was an issue with it.
But with the 11 o'clock, with the time, we can't really say much about it. But the fact that you leave a child unattended, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
You can't say, okay, that's culturally whatever.
Yeah, but they may have been left alone from very young age, or had to go to the shop, because if kids have been raised by parents that aren't coping, they may have been out wandering from a very, very young age.
I guess we are a bit too protective. I used to roam around when I was a child.
That's generational cultural expectations have changed as well. For many of us, you're expected to be out of the house from dawn to dusk, and, come home when the streetlights come on. These days, you'd probably get a report if you did that. It's challenging and nuanced. We're humans, we need sleep. If the way they're managing the children, they're not getting much sleep, yes, you can get accustomed to it, but is it good for you? And is there a better way of sorting things out? I had one client, they had quite young children, and he wanted a day about arrangement. The rationale was that he'd see them every day, but we had to have a conversation about what's it like for them, sleeping in a different bed every night, having to move their stuff, and eventually decided that he'd maybe him seeing the children every night was less important than them having a little bit more stability. Yeah, so Leah, juvenile correction system is like, I despair a little bit about the juvenile correction system. There are some good programs, but others turn very young children into perpetrators and don't necessarily support trying to correct the damage. There are some good programs where there's mentors that come in, and so they have good role models. There was some really good programs being done up in Northern Territory with elders coming in and mentorship, but again, they chop and change. I think a lot more could be done. I used to say no one's born predisposed to be a criminal or to be anything, but my understanding's changed. So, yeah, often people are born with a difficult to manage brain.
Some people are more prone to develop those tendencies than others genetically.
Yeah. But if they're given optimal or even probably good enough care, then things will change. But where you've got the generational factors, so that there's also the parenting issues for the parents because of where they've come or whatever, that can go. Lee, did you want to add some more to that?
Hi, Joanne. No, I was enjoying just sitting back and listening, because I have a background. I spent 30 years in teaching and education, and then my courses sort of led me into child consulting. And a friend of mine who's an FDRP actually said, you should investigate this option. So anyway, I've started my own business and I'm working in this space now, and everything that I've seen you present, I've gone, oh yes, of course, it all sort of has come back together, and it's a really good reinforcement that I'm in the right place for me. I was just really interested about, we're in Western Australia, so you probably hear a lot about Banksia Hill and the things that happen here in the West, and I was just really interested to understand what options there are for young people when they come back out into their family environment, and understanding, I do understand about intergenerational trauma and those sorts of things, and how you break that cycle so the next generation becomes firm, confident, healthy, physically and mentally young people. For me, it's been a really great webinar, so thank you. I was just curious to see other people's experiences and what they all come together, and knowing that what I'm doing is a right fit in this space. So
that's great. Yeah, I think connecting the dots, because we're all of the different modalities that we might work or have come from, they're all connected. It's kind of, I don't know if you've heard about that story about the three blind men describing an elephant. One says it's like a hose, it's kind of long and squishy, and the other one saying, oh, it's like a tree trunk, and the other, oh no, it's like a whip. It's the same thing, just different parts of it we're looking at. Or one of the practices, family group conferencing, being used a fair bit in New South Wales, really effectively bringing together families with kids that are having difficulties. You need to bring more people, you need a community around them. For kids that have been in trouble, having adults that they can lean on. If mum's having difficulties, if she's having an episode, if they can go to grandma, or there's an aunt or someone that can get them to school if there's troubles. That's the sort of thing the family group conferencing does to try and help break those cycles. I'd like to see a lot more of that happening in the Western Northern Territory. It's a process that came out of New Zealand with Maori families, and it's very good. I think education, people don't know what they don't know. So I think it's important for any of us that work with families to try and gently, effectively educate. Please have a look at some of the videos, and you might even find that you can just use little snippets of video to share with clients during your preparation stages. And you don't have to create them yourself. There's the big bad internet's got a lot of, really brilliant people sharing this content. So thank you. We're up to time. I always know that because Rowena pops her face up to say, go on, Jo, you're up to time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay.